Hello everyone. Have you ever heard the terms like NDA, IND, or ANDA in the pharmaceutical industry and ever wondered what actually they mean? These are some of the most important regulatory pathways involved in drug development and approval. Whether it's launching a brand new medicine, starting a clinical trial, or introducing a generic drug into the market, it all starts here. In this video, we'll simplify NDA, IND, and ANDA in the easiest way possible, especially for pharmacy, biotech, and clinical research students and professionals. So make sure that you subscribe to the channel and watch this video till the end. Without further ado, let's start. So first and foremost, let us start by understanding the first key terminology, IND. IND is called as Investigational New Drug Application. Now, what exactly it is? An IND is filed with the FDA or any regulatory body before by a sponsor, which can be a pharmaceutical company or a researcher, to start human clinical trials for an experimental drug. Okay, and it is not an approval, it is request to proceed, which means that I have an experimental molecule which I want to test that particular drug in humans, in human clinical trial. That is the phase trials. Okay, so if you want to experiment your molecule or a drug on human participant, then you have to file what you called as an IND, which is investigational new drug application. Now, when do you require this IND to be filed? So you need to be filed during the phase trial. It is phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trial. You also need to file IND whenever a new drug crosses state lines for testing, which means that if a drug is to be tested in US, you need to file a separate IND. If that particular drug is to be tested in India, you need to file a separate IND. Okay, so if you are testing in different countries, different state, you need to file separate INDs. Now, this IND is not only limited to a particular chemical entity, but if you are testing that particular drug for both commercial and research purposes, then also you need to file the INDs. Okay. Now, let us understand what are the key components of this IND. Okay. So the first part is animal pharmacology and toxicology, which means that the IND application will consist of preclinical data, which will show that the drug is reasonably safe to test in humans and it has been tested in animals for pharmacology as well as toxicology aspect, and there are results in it. Second thing is the manufacturing information. So what is the composition of your experimental drug, the stability, the quality controls of the drug, and what kind of substance and product it is made of. Those details are present in IND. Last but not the least, the clinical trial protocols and the investigator info. So if you want to conduct a clinical trial, if you are seeking the permission, then what is the clinical trial protocol? What all activities will you perform? What is the study design? What is the qualification of the clinical investigator who will conduct this clinical trial? And what are the patient safeguards that you are implementing in this clinical trial and as defined in the protocol? Okay. Now you need to know that if you submit an IND to the FDA, the FDA has 30 days to review the IND. Okay. If there is no objection from the FDA, okay, the clinical trial goes to automatic approval, which means that if you don't hear from the FDA within 30 days, then you can begin the clinical trial. Okay, so that is about the IND. The next important terminology is NDA, which is called as New Drug Application. Now, what is the New Drug Application? So, an NDA is submitted again to the FDA or the regulatory authority after successful completion of all three phases of the clinical trial. Okay, it is very important. IND you applied before you began the clinical trial. NDA you apply after completing of phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trial. What does NDA contains? It contains everything the FDA needs or requires to evaluate whether to approve this drug for the public use, including the safety, efficacy, labeling and manufacturing data, which means that now your experimental drug has completed all the phases of the clinical trial, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Okay, and now there is enough amount of data which can clearly help FDA evaluate whether the drug is safe and efficacious for public use. And this particular new drug application also consists of information which clearly demonstrates safety of the medication, the efficacy of the medication. Okay, Then the labeling requirement, that what are you labeling this drug for, what are you marketing this drug for, and all the manufacturing data, so that they can evaluate whether this drug is to be launched in the market or not. Okay, so that is essentially the purpose of the NDA. Now, what exactly are the components of this NDA? So, as we've previously seen, that the preclinical studies are performed prior to IND. Okay, so animal toxicology, pharmacology, and safety data is there. Then you have in NDA your phase data, which is phase 1 to phase 3 clinical trial data, which demonstrate the effectiveness, followed by the drug chemistry and manufacturing, which clearly tells you that what are the ingredients used, what is the formulation of this particular drug, and what are the quality controls parameters used to manufacture this drug. Again, the purpose labeling, which means that it will clearly define information in package insert about the dosage, indication, contraindication, warning, and how to use this particular drug. That is the labeling of the drug. Next thing is the patent information. So any applicable patent and patent certification under the Hatch-Waxman Act of the United States, so that particular information will also be present in the NDA, so that they can get exclusive rights for to market this drug for a limited amount of time, which is essentially 10 to 15 years. And again, the post marketing safety plan, which means that not only the FDA is asking you to submit the drug so that you can get approval, but FDA will also ask you that once the drug is in the market, what are your plans to evaluate the risk, and what are the mitigation strategies, that in case there is any adverse reaction, adverse drug reaction, or any serious adverse event, how post marketing safety plans are being implemented by the pharma company. Okay, so that information is also present in the NDA. Again, to review the NDA, the timeline is different. For IND, it was 30 days. For NDA, the FDA requires at least 10 months to evaluate, because you have to consider it is a large amount of data, a big decision whether to let the drug market in the public use. Okay, and if you have the drug for priority review for rare diseases, for cancer medication, or in case of any pandemic related medication, the priority review is for 6 months. Okay, now what is the average approval rate for NDA? So 85 to 90% of the NDA are approved. Okay, which means that if you submit 100 studies, almost 85 to 90 studies or 90 medications are being approved by the FDA. Okay, but you also have to understand that there are 10 to 15 medications which are rejected after years of clinical trial, after submitting phase trial data. Still, if that drug is not efficacious or has safety concern, FDA still rejects that particular drug. Okay, so that is all about the NDA. Now let us understand what is ANDA. ANDA stands for abbreviated new drug application. Now, when do we use ANDA application? It is the application that you submit to allow generic drug manufacturer to seek approval for a drug, to display that their manufactured drug is bioequivalent to already approved brand drug, which means that once the patent expires of a particular drug, anyone with that particular formula can manufacture that drug. But there is a difference between manufacturing and marketing. Okay, so you can manufacture that drug, but you have to display bioequivalence to clearly determine that the brand medication and the generic medication that you have produced has same bioequivalence, same efficacy. Okay, so new clinical trials are not required for ANDA. Okay, the FDA relies on the innovator's safety and efficacy data, because if you are using the same chemical entity, same molecule, then the safety data is already established. What you have to show is that are you able to replicate that particular formula or medication at the optimal level. Okay, that is the bioequivalence. So in ANDA, you do not require to conduct clinical trial. Essentially, for some countries, they have the requirement, you have to do that, but most often than not, you are required to display bioequivalence. Okay, now what are the key requirement for ANDA? So as we have discussed, bioequivalence is one of the most key requirement for bioequivalence. The generic drug must deliver the same amount of active ingredient in the bloodstream, which means that at the same rate, same efficacy, the generic drug should perform. And you conduct the bioequivalence studies in human participant, which means that the human participants are given the same brand drug as well as the generic drug, and the generic drug has to show that it has the same amount of active ingredient and efficacy in healthy volunteers. Okay, that is about the ANDA. Now let us understand the difference, okay, between NDA and ANDA. Okay, the difference between the brand new drug and the generic drug. Okay, so if you consider the drug type, so the first one in NDA would be the brand new drug, okay, which is uh, first introduced by the pharma company. The ANDA is the generic copy of the drug. Okay. Now, what is the requirement for clinical trial? So for NDA, you require to conduct phase trial, that is 1, 2, and 3. For ANDA, you do not require to conduct phase trial, but you require to conduct the bioequivalence studies. Okay. So essentially for safety and efficacy, it relies on innovator data. Now, does NDA requires bioequivalence study? No, because they already conduct phase trial, but for ANDA, you require bioequivalence studies. What is the review timeline? For NDA, it is 10 months, but for ANDA, it is 10 to 15 months because there is a huge amount of medicine that are losing their patents and there is a huge amount of people making generic copies of it. So there is a backlog, therefore the timeline has been increased. Okay, now what is the cost to development? So to develop any particular new molecule, new drug, you require $1 to $2 billion. But since that molecule is already developed, the patent has already expired and everyone knows about the chemistry of the drug, then the making ANDA is 1 to 5 million. That is the primary reason that you get generic drug very very cheap, because they are made with a capital of 1 to 5 million, and the brand name drug has the research baggage or the research cost which costs around 1 to 2 billion. Okay, so that is the obvious reason why the generics are cheaper, because they do not invest in R&D. The patent is already out there. Okay, so 1 to 5 million is the manufacturing cost. So that is about the ANDA. Now let us see the IND, NDA and ANDA in the larger scheme of drug development. So as you can see here, you can clearly see that you file the IND application, okay, before the clinical trial. Okay, before this particular phase trial, you file the IND. Once the phase trial is completed, what you do is you go and submit the NDA. Okay, and once that particular medicine or brand drug loses its patient, you again submit the ANDA application and you perform the bioequivalence study. Okay, that is the BE studies. Okay, and once the FDA approves, you get the FDA approval. Okay, here, and you can market that particular drug. Okay, so now you have a clear understanding the difference between IND, NDA, and ANDA. Okay, now what are the key takeaways you need to understand? That whenever we talk about IND, it is the permission to test the drug in humans, and it is required to conduct before you conduct a clinical trial. NDA would be the formal approval of the US FDA to market your drug to the general public. ANDA would be streamlining the generic drug approval. So whenever you talk about ANDA, it is about the generic drug and you need to show the bioequivalence but do not need to conduct clinical trial. And last but not the least, all three application processes are regulated by the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. So CDER evaluates all three applications. Okay, so I hope you were able to get a clear picture about IND, NDA, and ANDA. Make sure you subscribe to the channel to stay connected and get such quality content. Thank you.